I'm Will Carter. This is my 1958 Triumph TR3A. My love of cars came from growing up with my father, who was quite an advocate of old British cars. He has an old AC Bristol, and he used to race it. I think he gave up racing around the time that my older sister was born. But he's always loved the old British cars. He had brought me up and showed me how to repair the cars. We restored the cars together, and I've just always appreciated the simplicity of the pure old British sports car. I found this car through the Historic Automobile Association. I was a member of the club, had the car for about 20 years, and he hadn't restored it. I was actually out looking for an MGA, and I came back to the club and was telling him how disappointed I was in the car that I had just looked at, and he says, well, I have this old TR3, and maybe you might want to have a look at it. He was very proud of all of the parts that he collected for the car, and he just really wanted to show off what he had collected. And I asked him if he would be, interested in selling it, and he said he might be, and I went over to have a look at it. I knew right away that I wanted to buy it. He had probably a larger pile of parts than what the car took up in space. So it became pretty clear that it was well worth the effort to try to reassemble this car after having it not be on the road for over 20 years. In order to get it into this condition, I had to go through the boxes and boxes of parts. The previous owner had collected so many parts and documentation. He had the original books which showed every part number for every part on the car, as it was for this particular car, which is September 1958. So he told me that when I put the car together, find all of find the box of parts that he has and sort out the right one for this car. And so it became quite a neat exercise, a little bit like putting together a puzzle. To try to assemble this car to beyond numbers matching. It's not just a matter that the engine matches the car. It's really a case of where every single part on that engine is the right part for this car. Right down to the point where I have on the side of the engine in red paint is the letters TR3 written by hand with a paintbrush, which would have been the markings that were put on that engine in the factory to designate that this engine went to this sports car and not to the tractor where this engine was also used. So that was quite interesting, where you get that kind of provenance on the car to where I can now say that it is exactly the way it would have been coming out of the factory. He had collected everything, including the original Lucas headlights. Headlights like this have often been replaced by sealed beam, which is more of a modern headlight. These ones still have the original replaceable bulbs in it. Things like the driving lights are original Lucas driving lights, not a reproduction. There is very little reproduction of any parts on this car. A few parts you had to find the modern replica of it, but for the most part, it's exactly the way it should have been. There was some details in electrics which were very interesting. Everybody seems to really worry about Lucas electronics. I think they call it Lucas the Prince of Darkness when it comes to British cars. Lucas electronics are actually fine as long as you keep it original. As soon as you try to think that you know how to do it better than Lucas did, the car starts to have these nightmarish short circuits and overheating and this kind of thing. So I've learned that you restore the car back to exactly the way it should have been, and that means that this hasn't been upgraded to having an alternator. It still has the original generator and regulator. In fact, I got a box of regulators from the gentleman who sold me the car, and in that box were brand new parts that have never been used, so original equipment from the manufacturer. And I've had no problems with a Lucas electronics in this car. And it's a brand new wiring harness, but again, it was original stock and still with the cloth wire loom. The car came with about 32 SU carburetors, and he was adamant that when I put the car together, I find the right carburetor with the right with the right fittings and make sure that it's exactly the way it should have been. There's a fuel shutoff valve, for instance, going to the carburetor, that the idea was that if you park the car for any period of time, you actually push down this fuel shutoff and turn it, and it actually has the original cork seals on it. So it was really an exciting car to do, partly because I didn't really know what the car was going to look like when I built it, because it was all disassembled. So it's a little bit like trying to do a really complicated puzzle with about 3 other puzzles mixed in, because you had so many parts that either belonged in this car or didn't, and you had to sort through all of that, read the documentation, look at the history of the car. This car was interesting in the fact that it also came with the original Brooklyn racing windshields, which are very rare and almost impossible to get now. It has its original windshield that you would have taken off on British track days. If you went off to race for the weekend, you would arrive with the full windshield on. With 2 quick connectors, you would take the windshield off, race for the afternoon, pop the windshield back on again and go home. This car is what they call the Grand Touring model. I think that Triumph tried to come up with a model that you could actually drive in the wintertime. So it has a full weather gear. It has a full original metal hardtop for it, cloth side curtains. It has a cloth rag top as well. All of that stuff is all original and belongs to this car. So it makes it quite a complete model. Now that the car is fully restored, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with it. I have often restored these cars and sold them when I find something more interesting. I would love to do a Jaguar E-Type, but this car, you really start to fall in love with the car after, well, in this case, I sanded it for 3 months. The whole restoration took 7 months, which is pretty fast by restoration standards. But when you consider that 3 months of that was just sanding, you can't sand a car for that long without falling in love with it. I think that what I will end up doing is driving the car and keeping it. I can't see selling it at any time soon. It would have to be something really interesting would have to come along for me to part with it. About a month after I had finished restoring it, I had a gentleman pulled into my driveway just because he saw it on the driveway and offered me quite a lot of money for it, and I had to turn him down and tell him I've just finished it and I haven't even enjoyed it yet. The car is an absolute dream to drive, surprisingly. I think my favorite part about the car is the amount of detail that's gone into making it correct, and really I love driving it. It does drive like a race car, and they were used for racing, and I wanted to feel that. So I wanted to make sure that everything stayed as period correct as absolutely possible. Nothing has been upgraded or modernized, which means that driving the car becomes a real trip back into history. Every car has its quirks. There are no synchronizers in first gear, which means you have to come to a complete stop. There is an overdrive on it, but you can definitely, when you feel the car and drive the car, you can sense what it was like to race them. They were an absolute thrill. So that's my favorite part, is really driving the car at the end of the historic restoration and everything that went into that.